All right, let's start looking at your notes for figurative language. So, the difference between figurative language versus literal language is that there's kind of this layer, right? Literal language is on the surface. So, what does the author say? So, if they're describing a tree, the literal interpretation of that tree is that it's something with branches and bark that grows, okay? Whereas the figurative language is more, symbolic, or any type of language that goes beyond the literal. So if the author is writing about how this character looked up at this tree every day of their life, there's probably something more symbolic to the presence of that tree. So on the surface, we have what's the literal level, and anything that takes a little bit more inference and interpretation, that's what we have on the figurative level. And that's really what we're going to be focusing in on with both prose, but particularly for right now, poetry. So let's begin with something familiar, symbols. Now you're all, I think, have heard the expression that something is a symbol for something else, but I do want to kind of differentiate between the types of symbol. So a conventional symbol is like the American flag. That is an item that is a symbol for patriotism, a symbol for whatever abstract idea you want to attribute it to. Conversely, a literary symbol is tied to a text, so a novel, something specific. And those are kind of the two types of ways we look at symbols. And for our purposes, obviously, we're looking at literary symbols. Now, the best way to kind of talk about how you go about analyzing a symbol is that you're really looking at something concrete that is standing for something abstract. So remember, concrete, abstract nouns, those are kind of what we're dealing with. Now, I use the word concrete loosely because sometimes there can be some abstract things that symbolize other abstract things. But I think for now, the best way to think about it is that a concrete something is a symbol for something abstract. Another way to say it is that it represents something abstract. So the tree is a symbol for life, or the tree represents life, would be how we kind of go about looking at symbols. So let's look at an example poem here. Let me pull it up. This is Acquainted with the Night by Robert Frost, and what we're going to talk about is how we go about deciding, ooh, that was really bad looking, night represents what. So let's just read through first, and then I'll kind of go through the different images and things that stick out to me to kind of build that symbol. So this is Acquainted with the Night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet, when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. But not to call me back or say goodbye, and further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. So just off the bat, there's a few words that I want to draw your attention to. We have mention of light here, but then it kind of goes to the saddest and the dropping my eyes. And then we come down here and talk about this interrupted cry, which I'll come back to in a second. But down here, we're back to this idea of luminescence or luminary clock, which is related to light. So one thing I notice from point A to B is we're talking about light here. We're talking about light here, but it's actually a poem about night, which is kind of typically something you associate with darkness, right? So there's kind of this progression from dark, talking about the dark city streets, right, all the way to light. The other thing I kind of noticed as I was annotating before was this interrupted cry, which if you keep reading down further to here, it's talking about the clock. So there's kind of this imagery of this dark, quiet night when all of a sudden this clock kind of comes out of nowhere and breaks that darkness. So I think symbolically then, we're kind of going from a place where our speaker is sitting here with dropped eyes, right? But then they're looking up at this clock, which is at an unearthly height. Oh, I can't spell height. So again, we have this idea of looking down, but then here they're looking up. So something that I would attribute that to, which I can also attribute up here with dark and light, is this idea of hope. Because he's walking down these sad, dark lane city streets, right? Until there's this shift with the uninterrupted cry, and then suddenly he's looking up. To me, this is kind of symbolic of those times when you're downtrodden and you're struggling until something comes and breaks up that feeling to give you hope for the future. So in this case, night represents the darkness, right? But if we're going to use this same idea, night could represent hopelessness, meaning that this author is talking about how they've faced hopelessness in the past. And from there I could build my analysis of that particular symbol. All right, let's go back to our notes. The next thing we will talk about is this idea of allegory. Now, allegory is actually something a little bit more common, I think, in prose, but it does happen in poetry as well. And in an allegory, put simply, is just kind of like two parallel stories. There's the literal and the figurative, okay, so the literary. And I think the best way to kind of think about that is to talk about how the crucible is an allegory for the Red Scare, or the communist witch hunt, essentially, that happened during the 1950s. Because in both of these situations, we start here. There's fear. In the crucible, it's that hysteria that follows, that comes after the dancing. In the Red Scare, it was kind of launched by the existence, by this fear of communism. And that was kind of step one in both. In this case, we can see the parallel is fear. Then the existence of what they feared is validated. So like in the Red Scare, some Russian spies were uncovered. Some people did admit to being communist. Whereas like in the Crucible, Tituba admits to practicing voodoo, which they take as witchcraft, right? But it validates those fears that they have. So in both the Crucible and the actual Red Scare, we get that validation of the fear. Then the accusations begin, and as you know, one of the first people accused is Martha Corey, or Giles' wife, but more so Elizabeth Proctor, because that's what Act 2 is really about in the Crucible. And then the same thing, a wide range of accusations went out during the Red Scare, both for accusations, both, in the celebrity community. They created the blacklists where they started kind of making life even more difficult for those people that they were suspicious of, until ultimately it becomes a power struggle. Think of Abby in the Crucible and how she's trying to use this power she has to get rid of Elizabeth Proctor. The same thing, Joe McCarthy was accused of the same things, trying to eliminate his political enemies by accusing them of communism. So how this relates to allegory is we're following these kind of same steps. I mean, the events are slightly different on either side, but ultimately there's a lot of parallelism that's happening throughout there. So when we're looking at a text like a poem or a story like The Crucible, this is how we'd go about explaining how one is an allegory for the other. The next term or piece of figurative language I want to talk about is irony. Now, irony can be a little bit challenging to describe. It's easier when you can see it and look at it and have an example. So we'll do both, but first let's kind of define some terms. And situational irony is what happens. I'm going to write slowly so you can see my handwriting. Is different than what was expected. So that is your very basic definition of what irony is. It's kind of an oversimplification, and I think once we start looking at the example, we'll make a little bit more sense of that. But it's essentially when a text is kind of marketed as one way and then goes in a different way. For example, the one we're going to look at, this ad, is coming off as an advertisement when really it's creating some commentary on the context at the time. Verbal irony, I think the easiest way to talk about that is sarcasm is a great example. It's essentially just the tone doesn't match the content. So, for example, if we think of, there's a text called A Modest Proposal in which Jonathan Swift proposes that the starving Irish eat their children to survive. The tone is very straightforward, matter of fact, but he's actually talking about something really horrific. So that's kind of an example of irony in itself. Now, when it's said out loud, that's where the verbal irony comes in. The next part is satire. Now, satire is something that we will talk about at length, but it's basically the use of humor and irony or exaggeration to kind of poke fun at something or to pick out an issue. So I think the simplest kind of way of defining it is satire is what happens when you add irony and context. So for example, it employs all the same strategies that irony has, but it's also paying attention to whatever the context is at that moment. So, like I said, these definitions probably mean nothing so far, but let's look at an example, and that should help clarify a little bit. So this is our text, and like I said, context is important. So this was written during World War II, and I want you to pay attention to the language that this author uses and how it comes off as ironic. So wanted, men, millions of men are wanted at once in a big new field, new, tremendous, thrilling, great. If you've ever been a figure in the chambers of horror, if you've ever escaped from a psychiatric ward, if you thrill at the thought of throwing poison into wells, have heavenly visions of people by the thousands dying in flames, you are the very man we want. We mean business, and our business is you. Wanted, a race of brand new men. Apply Middle Europe, no skills needed, no ambition required, no brains wanted, and no character allowed. Take a permanent job in the coming profession. Wages, death. So obviously there's a few lines in there that kind of are unexpected. So that's what I was talking about, where what happens in the text is different than what you anticipate. Because up until, I would say, this part right here, it seems like a normal advertisement. It's very vague, just saying, hey, here's a new job. It's exciting. It's great. But now it says a figure in the chamber of horrors. Okay, that language of horror is a sudden change from the kind of lightheartedness of the advertisement prior to that. Then it says they want people who have escaped from psychiatric wards, or thrill at the thought of throwing poison into wells, or have heavenly visions of people dying by the thousands, dying in flames. Obviously, there's not a person in the world that would outwardly say that they enjoy those things. I mean, we would probably call that person a psychopath. So when they're kind of creating this advertisement, seeking out these people, they're obviously not genuinely asking for these types of applicants. If we think about the context, and it's talking about men who are willing or enjoy all of these things, you can make the assumption that they're talking about Nazi guards. Think about the concentration camps and how these people had to be willing to do all these horrific things for it, unfortunately, for the events to transpire that did at that time. But by phrasing it as an advertisement, it's kind of achieving two purposes. One, it's mocking the people who would elect to do something like this by really characterizing them by all these horrible descriptors. Okay? And then as we go down here, I think further details that no brains wanted and no character allowed are pointing out the type of people that this poet thinks are capable of doing such horrible things. So, in this case, the irony is in the fact that it's written like an advertisement seeking employment or people for a certain job, but really it's not actually doing that. On the surface, it's doing that, but the figurative level is that they are pointing out all the horrific things that these Nazi guards and soldiers did to kind of bring attention to how horrible it was. So that's our example for irony. I hope that helps. Like I said, irony is something that takes time to grasp. It's not an easy concept. So it's something we'll kind of learn as we get going. And then next semester, we'll do a whole unit on satire, and then we'll really dig into that one. The next one I want to talk about is metaphors. Now, I'm very sure that you are all very familiar with metaphors. So I'm going to kind of go to the next level and talk about specific kinds or more challenging kinds of metaphors. Because as you know, a metaphor is just a comparison between anything, a figurative comparison that's created to describe something, to prove a point, and so forth. But I want to talk about what an implied metaphor is and an extended metaphor, because those are probably ones you haven't heard of. So to begin, an implied metaphor is one that the author doesn't come right out and state it, but it's created in the language they use. So for example, let me write down, he brayed his refusal to leave. If we look at this, there is a comparison being made between whoever he is and a donkey. The reason I know that is this word right here. When we're talking about the sounds an animal makes, really a bray is pretty unique to a donkey. So it's implied because it doesn't say he was a donkey. Rather, it picks out an attribute of that creature, in this case the donkey, that can be used to still create that metaphor. So an implied metaphor is just, it doesn't just come right out and say it, but from reading the context you can infer the metaphor. So I'm going to write infer, because being able to infer the comparison that's happening means it's an implied metaphor. The next one I want to talk about is an extended metaphor. An extended metaphor is a little bit easier, frankly, than the implied metaphor, but really all it is that it's a more detailed or a more extensive metaphor. And I think the best way to figure that one out is to look at an example. So let's switch to our passage here. And this is the road not taken. The road is the metaphor that we're going to be looking at. And just like before we even jump in, I'm going to go through this to pick out different references to the road or travel or journeying to kind of illustrate how throughout the poem it's developing this extended metaphor. So 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay It leaves no step had trodden black. Steps would be about a road. Oh, I keep the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So in this case, you can see there's multiple references to the idea of the road throughout the poem, and that's really what makes it an extended metaphor. If it was just, maybe these 2 lines right here, that's a standard metaphor. But because it keeps coming back to this idea of a road and creating the imagery of the road, like even things like the undergrowth and the wear of the road and things like that, all develop this extended metaphor of the road. So based on that, we would say that the road is an extended metaphor for, or again, represents, in this case, life's journey. So we have kind of our template there. Blank represents blank, right? And like I said, this is just a good example of an extended metaphor because you can see from what I've circled, it's being developed throughout the text. All right. Next up, after metaphor, let's talk about imagery. So imagery, I think, is probably pretty familiar. I might need a lighter purple. But what we are looking for in this sense, in this device, is anything that really provides description using those different senses we have as humans. So, sight, what does something look like? I think this is probably the most common type of imagery, because when we think of imagery, we often think of like a photograph, and in that situation, we're looking at it, we're seeing the trees, we're seeing the leaves, we're seeing the road that's been trodden on, right? So that's probably the most familiar. Another one would be sound. Sound is something that I think is used very often. Any type of imagery that provides insight into what you might be hearing if you're in that setting would be sound imagery. So a crackling fire, that's sound imagery because I can hear that crackling sound. The next one is smell. A little less common than maybe sight and sound, but often people can talk about the sense, especially in poetry. Poetry is jam-packed with imagery. So talking about if it's something floral, how does the grass smell? How do the flowers smell? Sometimes a poem is trying to create that sense of a decrepit old building, so they might talk about the mustiness of the air, kind of a foul smell. That would be an example of scent imagery. And then the other two, taste is kind of hard. People do use it, don't get me wrong, especially if they are talking about something that is edible, but people can describe something by how it tastes the same way they can describe something's smell or how it sounds. And then the last one is touch. Often used to describe textures, feelings. Temperature is part of touch. Those kind of descriptors are still part of imagery because it's giving you a sense of what it feels like for the person that's sitting in that, whatever that given scene is. So let's look at a really short example. This is, oopsies. Oh no, I'm closing it. Now we gotta awkwardly sit here while I reopen my poems. Okay, it wasn't that long. Let's go down to November Night by Adelaide Crapsey. That's an unfortunate last name, but hey, it is what it is. And let's pick out some of the different examples of imagery. So it says, listen with faint dry sound like steps of passing ghosts. The leaves frost crisped break from the trees and fall. So right here, pretty obviously we have sound imagery. That faint dry sound that we're talking about with leaves. The steps of passing ghosts could be sight or sound in that it's very quiet, right? The leaves frost crisped. You can hear the sound of them crunching below your feet, but it's also the sight of what they look like. And it might also be touch in terms of what that leaf feels like. And then as they fall from the tree, we have some sight imagery. So this is an example of just in this little 5-line poem. There's a tons of different imagery represented that you can kind of pick out. And I would say, as you're doing your analysis, imagery is always a good go-to for poetry, because poetry is built on the images and the very careful word choice. So that said, I think you'd be able to use that kind of in every poetry analysis we do. All right, up next is a reading assignment. So if you would pause your video here, because I would like you to read chapter 12 of How to Read Like a Professor. The How to Read Like a Poetry Like a Professor books are in the same place as the literature ones, tall cabinet by the door. Go ahead, read chapter 12, add to your notes, and then we'll pick up with syntax, tone, and diction as soon as you're done. All right. Now, let's talk about word choice and language, okay? The simplest thing we got to think about is connotative meaning and denotative meaning. And really what those are is that idea of figurative. Oops, I did that wrong. Sorry, ignore me, ignore me, ignore me, ignore me. Figurative and literal. So when we're talking denotative, you might have been taught that that's the dictionary meaning, right? So that would be literal, meaning that they're using the word exactly as it was intended and how it is intended, how it's, I should say, listed in the dictionary. Whereas connotative meaning is more figurative and more based on your interpretation and things like that. So, lucky you have another reading assignment. This time is to read chapter 6. And what chapter 6 is going to talk to you about is this idea of speaker. So if you were in AP last year, we did a lot of rhetorical analysis, and that was very author-focused. So the author is doing this, the writer is doing this. But when we're talking about literature, especially poetry, we have to remember that the person telling the story isn't the author. It's a narrator, okay? Even if it is third-person omniscient, it's not necessarily being told from the author's perspective. So this chapter from How to Read Like a Professor is actually about poetry and how we talk about it in terms of a speaker, not necessarily the poet themselves. So go ahead, read chapter 6, please. Again, the books are with the other ones. Pause your video and we'll pick up when you're done. Okay, the next thing we're going to tackle is tone, which is incredibly difficult, I won't lie to you. And that's just kind of how it is. Tone in nonfiction is really the author's attitude, but tone in fiction is kind of the feeling that the author wants to create. So it could be the narrator's tone, but again, remember, like you hopefully read in your chapter from How to Read Poetry, we're not talking about the author as the voice behind the writing anymore. So it's not accurate to say the tone is the author's attitude in this context. So to talk about tone, I think the best way to kind of illustrate is to use some of the basic emotions. So if you have not seen it, there is a Pixar movie called Inside Out. And in the movie, there are 5 little emotions that kind of make up all of the memories of the girl, right? Happy, sadness, well, joy is the character. Sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. So starting with those are kind of your very basic fundamental emotions. That said, you might come across a multiple choice question, or in your writing, you can't just say, the tone in this section is sad. That's really an oversimplification when there is a wide range within sadness from point A to B, okay? So I like to refer to it as this idea of the shades of meaning. Because for all of these words, there's kind of a spectrum of happiness. There's kind of a spectrum for sadness. And so I'm just kind of going to go through an example for each of these so you can kind of see my thinking in terms of how I develop or how I can more accurately pick a tone word. So if we're talking about happiness or joy, I think a very meek version of happiness is to say that you're pleased, right? Whereas to say you're enthusiastic is still showing happiness, but it's definitely more happiness than just saying you're pleased with something. And the next level beyond that even would be to say that you're exuberant. So if I was reading a text and I was like, well, it's definitely happy, from there I can kind of pick which word on that spectrum of meaning or which shade of meaning am I looking for. Another example with sadness would be you'd start kind of disappointed, right? It's sadness, but it's not devastating. And then you could say the tone is hurt, all the way up to, like I said, devastated. When we're identifying tone, we need to be very specific about the word we would use to describe it. Because if we just say sad or happy, one, they're never going to give you that as an option on a multiple choice question. But two, in your analysis, if you simplify it that far, there's no way you can get the sophistication points because you're limiting what that author is doing to one of 5 very basic emotions. So let's do a couple more, just kind of highlight what I mean when I say shades of meaning. But for anger, you can go from angry to aggravated, all the way to irate. Again, irate, excuse me, irate is much more substantial than just saying you're angry. With scared, you can start out uneasy. To be a little bit more afraid, you'd be frightened. All the way to terrified. And finally, disgust, you can be annoyed. To irritated. Oops. All the way to repulsed. Oops. Now, within each of these little spectrums, there are hundreds of other descriptive words that kind of fit into place along the way. Your task, when we're talking about tone, is to pinpoint which word best describes that. So I do have some resources in Schoology to kind of help you with that. Some like wheels, just like when we were talking about character, we want to be very specific in how we describe them. The same is available with tone as well. All right, next up is to look at a poem. And let's think about tone as we're reading through this one. Another very famous poem, this one is called To the Virgins to Make Much of Time by Robert Herrick. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow is dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worst, time still can succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may, go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. So, just off the cuff, what I noticed is there's a lot of contrast in each of these paragraphs, right? So it's talking about smiles, but then it goes to dying. It goes from glorious to setting, talking about like resolution, setting in terms of ending. Talks about going from warmer and then to worse and worst, right? Go marry or forever tarry. So what I'm noticing in terms of tone is we kind of have two things going, because words like smiles, glorious, warmer, or merry, those are more happy. Whereas dying, setting, forever tarry, those are more sad. So for describing the tone, like I said, to say it's happy is too simple. But words like smile and glorious and warmer, those kind of all have a playful feel to them. If you think about summer with terms of warmer and the sun being out, and then you have glorious and people are smiling, there's a playfulness to that. But then sadness, the second half, this dying, setting, worse, I think that's rather serious. So if I was to talk about the tone, I would say it is playful, yet serious. And that is an analysis that I could do on that particular passage. All right, back to our notes. Syntax. I hate to tell you, those of you that were in AP last year, it doesn't go away. Okay? Syntax, put most simply, is sentence structure. Now, how do you talk about sentence structure? That's a good question, but there are some basics that you can use. So I'm going to give you a very, very basic grammar lesson. You have clauses and phrases, right? Clause has subject and verb. Phrase has what? Oops. There's a weird one. One or the other. Then you have the parts of your sentence, which are the subject and the predicate. These are kind of fundamental sentence pieces, right? So we're going back to like way back in the day grammar. Remember, a clause has a subject and a verb. A phrase has one or the other because it's not a complete thought. The subject is whatever is doing the action in the sentence, and the predicate is the elaboration on that, the verb and the rest, essentially. So when we're talking about syntax, we're talking about how these things are combined. Now, the basic ways to describe a sentence are to say that it is simple. So a clause would be a simple sentence. It has a subject and it has a verb. The end. You can say sentences are compound, which means that it has multiple clauses, right? So multiple subjects, multiple verbs. Or you can say that it is complex, which means a combination of clauses and phrases. So whenever we're talking about syntax in writing, we're obviously trying to derive meaning from it, but being able to describe it is the first step. So that said, syntax does appear on FRQs from time to time as an option, but I want to take this time to remind you, or to tell you if you don't know already, that whenever you're looking at a prompt at the top of an FRQ and it lists some literary elements, you're not confined to those. So for example, if syntax is something you really don't understand, you don't get, don't talk about it. You don't have to. It's just an option because sometimes it is relevant. For example, the character assessment from Unit 1 does suggest writing about syntax, and that's because the father and son speak in very short sentences. And what I can do with that is talk about how there's a lot of unspoken things between the father and son. So what is said out loud is very simple. And I could do an analysis further and further. But really when we're talking about syntax, we want to attribute it to meaning. For example, the father and son, why are those short sentences used? We can attribute it to emotion. So if you have a whole bunch of short sentences that come in a quick succession for the syntax, there's an excitement that goes with that. So that would be attributing it to emotion. Or sometimes it's for emphasis. For example, if a very short sentence appears on a page that has only very long sentences, there's emphasis put on that sentence. So for example, Charles Dickens is infamous for writing sentences that take up nearly an entire page in a text. So if he were to then have a very short sentence in the middle, that would draw the reader's attention. There would be some sort of reason behind that emphasis. Okay, like I said, syntax is not easy. If you're confused by it, I understand that. The good news is very few situations would you actually have to write about it, but it is another way you can approach the question. All right. The next part of your notes is on your own because it's really just summarizing or defining some of these terms. So in your notes, I'd like you to define these: pun, synecdoche, metonymy, allusion, personification, apostrophe, hyperbole, understatement, paradox, and oxymoron. I've chosen these because in actuality, guys, there's lists of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of poetic devices, but I wanted to pick the ones that I think are most prevalent in poetry. So if you could take the time, pause the video right now, go through, and just use, Google to define what these are. If you want to have very thorough notes, I would recommend trying to find examples. You can find examples very easily online, sometimes with the definition. So take a minute, go through, define these different terms, and then come back for the last part of the video. All right, the last thing I got for you in this very long video about figurative language is how do you talk about figurative language in general. It's very easy to just point to things and say, yes, the author uses hyperbole. Yes, the author uses metaphor. Yes, the author also does this thing. But what that's going to accomplish in an FRQ is what's called a tour boat essay. So if you think about being on a tour boat, or really any tour, you're in a group and you're being guided around by a person who's saying, over to the right, you'll see this. Over to the left, you'll see a castle, blah, 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 blah. A tour boat essay is doing that, but all they're doing is pointing at devices. So in paragraph 2, the author uses a metaphor. In paragraph 3, the author uses a symbol. What a tour boat essay fails to do is take that further. So, just like with syntax, here it is again. These are kind of the 3 ways you can analyze figurative language. 1, develop some sort of meaning. What does that symbol mean for the text? For example, if we refer back to that text from your character assessment, the fishing rod is a very important detail or symbol. And the meaning behind it could be about the father's sacrifice that he's making for his son, the father's understanding that their relationship is changing. That would be attributing meaning to that symbol. The next one, like I said, is emotion. What kind of emotion does it elicit to include that symbol? So, for example, if you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, at the end of the movie, her home is burned, it's reduced to nothing, but she's standing across this like red-orange sky, and in that moment, while she is determined to rebuild her home, you get a sense of, you feel inspired, you feel proud of her as a character. That would be a use of imagery to create emotion. And then just like with syntax, it could be used to emphasize something. So for example, I think a good example would be the Scarlet Letter. The first part of the whole book is literally just describing a rose bush. And so obviously there's an intention behind that. There's very infrequently does an author sit and talk about a rose bush for 5 pages, all right? What's being created in that is emphasis on the significance of that bush. And it's also using that, I guess what would be called that symbol, to really emphasize the dynamic of the town at the time. So the biggest thing is, I'm going to change to red so you know I mean business here. We don't want the tour boat essay. Don't just point to things for me. Don't just say the poem has musical imagery. Don't just tell me that the drums are a symbol for blank. You have to tell me why is that there. And that's where this little 3-word reminder comes from. So when you're doing that last step, that why piece, the purpose, this is kind of your 3 points to start with. Okay, that's it. This is a very long notes video. I appreciate you staying with me.